talk about that and a whole lot more with former Trump National Security Advisor and former UN Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador, good morning.
Glad to be with you.
Where do you think this goes, funding from the United States, from Congress, given the two things I just mentioned?
Well, I don't think further funding from Ukraine really is seriously in trouble. I think what's in trouble, and has been for some time, is the lack of a clear American and NATO strategy how to bring this war to a successful conclusion. This constant debate over whether we ship this weapon system or that weapon system means that in the aggregate, these weapons are not being used as effectively as they could be to help achieve the objective of getting the Russians out of Ukraine. That's what we need to hear.
Can I just ask you on the point of how this ends? It was just stunning to hear what former President Trump said to Caitlin in the CNN town hall last week about the fact that he thinks he would have been able to end the war in 24 hours. Here that is.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in 1 day, 24 hours.
How would you settle that war in 1 day?
Because I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over. It'll be absolutely over.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing.
I just wonder what it was like for you to sit there and listen to those answers.
Well, here's the silver lining. Those answers show why Donald Trump is not fit to be president of the United States. No rational person believes that you can get the Ukrainians and the Russians to agree how to resolve it in 24 hours. And the very fact he says he doesn't think in terms of winning and losing shows he's utterly out of touch with what the war is all about and what the implications of Russia's aggression against Ukraine are all around the world.
You once said that he barely knew where Ukraine was. And his notion that one thing he repeated that night as well was that he said if he was in office that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine.
Yeah. Trump has this impression that foreign leaders, especially adversaries, hold him in high regard, that he's got a good relationship with Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un. In fact, the exact opposite is true. I have been in those rooms with him when he's met with those leaders. I believe they think he's a laughing fool. And the idea that somehow his presence in office would have deterred Putin is flatly wrong. If anything, if Trump had won a second term and done what I think he intended to do, which is get out of NATO, Putin would have just waited and let him do it. And even the weakening of NATO would have made it a lot easier for the Russians to have prevailed.
You, turning to what's happening in Turkey right now in this runoff in 2 weeks, you have said that Erdogan, the Turkish president, is a Donald Trump of Turkish elections. If Erdogan does not remain in power, what does that mean for the NATO alliance, for the United States vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Well, I think there's a lot of question exactly how far Erdogan went to try and fix the first round, steal the election, let's be blunt about it. And I think really international attention has got to be focused on the next 2 weeks to see if he steals the second round. I'm afraid if he wins, that there will be real damage done to the NATO alliance, and I think we need to consider whether to suspend or even expel Turkey. If Erdogan is defeated, however, I think there's every reason to think that Turkey will return to being a more normal NATO member, not necessarily in every respect, but it would be a significant plus not only in Europe, where we face the Ukraine situation, but in the Middle East, where Erdogan has what can only be described as neo-Ottomanist aspirations to recreate a greater Turkey. And this is something that really is gravely threatening in an already very unstable region.
Yeah, we'll find out in 2 weeks what that runoff looks like. Back here at home yesterday, John Durham issued that pretty scathing report about the FBI. He was looking into the investigations of the Russia probe. You know, the report was scathing. He faulted them for starting the investigation, but there weren't any of the blockbuster revelations that Trump had been promising or his allies, saying it was the crime of the century. You once called the Mueller investigation a witch hunt. Do you still stand by that comment?
Well, I was struck at how much of Durham's report followed the Department of Justice Inspector General investigation of the investigation of Russia collusion. And I think Durham hit it on the head when he said there was a predisposition to investigate Trump. I've had a lot of dealings with the FBI over many years, beginning back in the Reagan administration when I served at the Department of Justice. I think it's an outstanding institution. I think 99% of the people in the FBI are patriotic Americans, really salt of the earth. But there are a number of them over the years who think they walk on water. And I think a lot of those people were involved in the Hillary Clinton investigation in 2016 and in the Trump investigation. And I think what the IG and the Durham report show is that their power went to their head. And that is dangerous in an institution like the FBI.
But you can criticize that. Do you still think the Mueller probe, though, in and of itself, into what it was looking into and the charges against the Russians was a witch hunt?
There was no evidence of collusion at all. What they looked at in the case of Russian contacts with the Trump campaign on the part of the campaign were incompetence and stupidity, not an effort to collude with the Russians.
Yeah, they found the links. And
Believe me, if I thought there was evidence of Donald Trump colluding with Russia, I would be getting it out there. There just isn't any, for good or ill.
Can I just ask you one other question before we go, which is another comment Trump made speaking of the rule of law last Wednesday night, is he left the door open to pardoning people who were charged with assaulting cops on January 6th, the Proud Boys convicted of seditious conspiracy. What did you make of him saying that he would consider pardoning most of them?
I think it's virtually treasonous for the president to say he would pardon people who are trying to disrupt the work of Congress. It's another example why he's not fit to be president. If anybody wants to know what a Trump administration would look like when he's pardoning the people who rioted on January the 6th, I think that's all you need to know.
John Bolton, as always, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you.